Thank you for coming out to a queer anti-militarism town hall. This is an audience that loves libraries and also knows how to do a good podcast. Thank you. I like a lively audience. My name is DAVIDA INGRAM, and I'm the Public Engagement Programs Manager at the library. I want to start our program by acknowledging that we are on Duwamish land. And actually, throughout this year, 2018, we are looking forward to doing several programs that are Native-led and centered around celebrating Coast Salish and urban Indian experience. So please keep hanging out with us. Tonight's program is made possible with support from the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Do we have any donors in the audience? Give yourselves a hand. Give yourselves a hand. So you may have noticed that this past weekend we had the Transgender Day of Inclusion. I'm really proud to say that the Seattle Public Library, when it comes to identities, that we are working to be inclusive all year round. So we have today's program, a queer anti-militarism town hall that was created primarily by transgender community members working with allies to build a cross-constituency dialogue about militarism. And on April 14th, hold on, I gotta adjust my slideshow. On April 14th, we will be holding Legendary Children. Have any of you all been to Legendary Children before? Can you make some noise? All right, so Legendary Children is a celebration of queer and trans people of color. Everybody is invited to this evening celebrating house and ball culture with live performances, hot DJs, and the artistry of some of the Pacific Northwest's most talented drag royalty and multi-talented performers. So come for the art and stay for the public runway. Tonight's conversation was made possible by our community curators, Dean Spade, Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore, Soya, Jung, and Angelica Cesaro. I hope I got Angelica's name said correctly. Instead of calling for the right to serve in the military, tonight's discussion focuses on challenging the violence of the military at home and abroad. Our panelists will speak from a broad range of organizing experiences, from challenging structural racism to fighting for migrant justice, indigenous sovereignty to prison abolition, anti-war activism to the movement against sexual violence. So please join me in welcoming our speakers for tonight. We have Micha Cárdenas, Nikkita Oliver, Soya Jung, Matt Remle, Dean Spade, and Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore. Can we give a round of applause for all of our speakers tonight? And just a quick note, because I'm very excited to hand the mic off. And speaking of handing off the mic, because tonight's program is being recorded for podcasts, but also because the library wants to challenge ableism, please use the mic when you are speaking. Please speak directly into the mic. It helps make the audio clear, but it also helps make sure that anyone with hearing impairment can hear the program. So please use the mic, even if you're like me. I'm from the south side of Chicago, and I'm very loud and very happy to use the mic. So turning the mics over to tonight's program curators. But before I do that, I want to thank our community partners. Jewish Voices for Peace, Seattle, the South Seattle Emerald, the Northwest Detention Center Resistencia et al. NWDC, International League of People Struggle, and we couldn't do it without our community partners or without our wonderful audience, so thank you.
Hi everyone, am I on the mic? You feel me? I'm Mattilda, thanks so much for coming tonight. I always like to say whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves, feel free. If you need to get up, if you need to walk around, if you need to laugh, if you need to cry, if you need to scream, if you need to dance, if you need to go to the bathroom, anything you need to do, Except we don't like quiet audiences, right? The only bad audience is the dead audience. And I can tell this is not a dead audience. Also, since this is a queer event this evening, and we are in one of the oldest cruising areas in the world, the library. So if anyone is looking for dates, please raise your hands. Hello, dates? Okay, there's gonna be time afterwards for dates. Look around and get ready. Now, when our so-called president first announced that he would ban trans people from the military, I imagined spectacular celebrations in cities across the country where trans people and anyone else with a conscience would welcome this news with extravagant opposition to militarism in all its forms. Maybe gender transgression could bring down the state after all. Unfortunately, though, the institutions that call themselves the LGBT movement have long been obsessed with acquiring state and straight power rather than challenging structural violence. Since the early 90s, when ending the ban on openly gay soldiers became a central goal of the branded national organizations, so-called LGBT leaders and their allies have draped themselves in the stars and stripes as the U.S. has obliterated Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and who knows how many other countries, all the while funding the Israeli war on the Palestinians, propping up countless despotic regimes, plundering indigenous resources, poisoning the land, air, and water, and indoctrinating youth into a lifetime of brutality and trauma. The fight for trans inclusion in the military borrows from more than 2 decades of rhetoric in support of gays in the military. But in many ways, it may be worse, since trans people don't even have a fraction of the access to resources that gay people had 25 years ago. Trans people are routinely kicked out of our families of origin, harassed in school and at work, persecuted by religious leaders and politicians, and attacked on the street simply for daring to exist. Trans people are often denied access to basic services like healthcare and housing, fired from jobs or never hired in the first place, and forced to flee the places where we grew up simply to survive. Trans women, particularly trans women of color, are brutally murdered at an astounding rate. How does the so-called LGBT movement respond to this frightening pattern of systemic violence and exclusion? By holding up military service as a path to assimilation. What better way to prove that trans people are healthy and fit for employment than by participating in war for corporate profit? We're told that military service is a human right, as if the human rights of the people in villages obliterated by drone bombings don't matter. Rather than calling attention to the structural conditions that make military service a tragic option for some people desperate to escape, internalize, and ultimately further oppression, the LGBT establishment aggrandizes military service as the gold standard for bravery. There's so much cognitive dissonance when people say they support trans inclusion in the military, but not war. What exactly do they think the military is for? Or when people say the military helps trans people to escape poverty, and then fail to mention the countless ways in which the military creates poverty. No one should have to become part of a murderous institution in order to escape a scary home, pay for college, or get out of a dead-end town. Nevertheless, this is what we're told is progress. Unfortunately, the left, which for decades ignored queer and trans lives, now features pro-military gay, queer, and trans people alongside in-depth coverage of the brutality of US wars, without even noticing the contradiction. This regressive tokenism is symptomatic of structural homophobia and transphobia. Just after Trump first announced his trans military ban, I turned on Democracy Now! And watched in horror as a trans woman with 18 years in the Army, including 3 active combat deployments in Afghanistan, extolled the glory of the military for 15 minutes without any serious questions. Then, a trans man currently stationed in Afghanistan told us that it was like a vacation because he could finally be his authentic self. After 20 minutes, Democracy Now! Finally allowed Dean Spade to articulate substantive critiques, but only while debating a pro-military filmmaker. If this is how our so-called allies cover our lives, it's hard to imagine our enemies. Tonight's event came about in response to that Democracy Now! Broadcast. Dean and I wanted to gather together queer and trans people from a wide range of social movements to challenge the violence of military inclusion. Now, the trans military ban is back in the news, and once again, the conversation is about who will be allowed to fight in unjust wars, rather than will the US ever stop destroying the world. Tonight is one small intervention, which we hope will inspire many more. Are we ready for a stunning mobilization of queer brilliance? Please have a round of applause for Micha Cárdenas, Soya Jung, Nikkita Oliver, Matt Remle, and Dean Spade.
Thanks so much, Mattilda, for that really helpful context setting, and so many thanks to everybody in the library, including DAVIDA and Bean in Orlando, and many others who've helped make this event happen, and to the wonderful speakers for being here, and all of you for wanting to be part of this conversation. We're just going to dive right in. So we wanted to avoid panelizing and have more like a conversation, because I think it's usually more interesting. And the first question that anybody can answer who wants to, but Micha said she would generously start us out. She's an Aries. The first question is, we're thinking about how so many different social movements have struggled with this question about military inclusion. This is obviously a very repeated question for marginalized groups in the United States. And so my question is, what movement lineages have shaped your perspective on U.S. militarism or movement experiences or other experiences and what have they taught you?
Thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me. It's such an honor. You know, when you invited me and when I was getting ready today even, I was like, what the fuck do I know about this? Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to say that in the podcast. Oh, great, okay. I was like, I don't know anything about this. But I do, actually. When I think about anti-militarism, I just actually don't use those terms. I mean, thinking about my personal experience, my father is Colombian, and he was imprisoned when I was 10 years old. And that had a huge effect on me, and a huge effect on shaping my ideas of politics. And I came to understand the drug war as being part of colonization. So I don't actually think much about anti-militarism. I think a lot about decolonization, and because colonization is not something that happened in the past, it's something that's ongoing. And when we say at the beginning of this event that this is land of the Duwamish people, what does that mean? Well, it means that we're the invaders that have been here for what, 100 years, 200 years, calling this place Seattle, this land that for tens of thousands of years belonged to other people, to the Duwamish people. And for this part of the country to be settled was the end of a long process of colonization of this country, meaning the murder of over 10 million Native people, 98% of the Native people in the United States, for us to be here. So that requires a really big war machine to do that. And that process continues. Certainly if we left, I'm sure the Duwamish people would be thrilled to have this city back, or this country back. And also it continues in what we might call neo-colonialism, but whatever, it's just colonization anyway, in terms of the US control or domination of other countries like Colombia and Latin America, so that the rest of the world can serve as like raw resources and as sweatshops for people in the United States to continue having the kind of lifestyles that we do. So colonization's really at the center and basis of my politics and thinking about this topic. In terms of movement lineages, it was actually anti-war activism through which I first got involved in like protest kind of activism in San Diego with the San Diego Coalition for Peace and Justice, organizing against the war in Iraq in 2003. I remember people were talking then about the war in Iraq being like the first war since Vietnam and like being a major shift. But since then, and really since the war in Afghanistan, we've just had a state of perpetual war.
I love that you framed this in terms of colonization. I mean, I think of myself as a child of war, right? I grew up in the 70s in a suburb of Buffalo, New York. My parents came to the United States in the early 60s before the 1965 Immigration Act, sort of lifted the ban on immigrants from Asia and the Pacific. And they came, one on a World Health Organization scholarship, and the other on an Atomic Energy Commission scholarship. And they both came not very long after the end of a brutalizing war on the Korean Peninsula. So one of the things that, I remember hearing stories of my mother as a child. She was responsible for cooking for her entire family from the age of like 7. And she would talk about finding abandoned helmets of soldiers on the ground and using that as cooking vessels. And she wouldn't even make a thing out of it. She'd just say, oh yeah, and then I cooked this thing in a helmet. And so it's that kind of reality that my parents' generation came from. And at the same time, growing up in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of context for being Korean American in upstate New York in the 70s. So, but what was happening was a kind of global economic reordering. And so you would hear a lot about the auto wars and about kind of Japan taking over. So there was quite a bit of anti-Asian kind of racism at that time. The irony being, of course, that the Japanese economic miracle
really took place because of the Korean War. You know, Japan's economy was devastated after World War II. World War II ended 35 years of brutal Japanese occupation of Korea. And the way that Japan's economy recovered was because the United States needed a staging area for logistics for the war on the Korean Peninsula. So these are the ways in which I think that our stories, even, you know, oppressor oppressed, colonizer colonized, right? Our stories are linked in the logic of imperialism and global capitalism. And I think, you know, one of the ways that I have started to knit together, and you know, I'm constantly kind of learning about this stuff, but when I was maybe starting in my teens and 20s, like starting to read about this stuff, really to make sense of myself and my place in the world, you know, coming across speeches like Dr. King's Beyond Vietnam speech, where he so clearly and painstakingly lays out the connections between racism, and particularly anti-Black racism in the United States, and capitalism and militarism. You know, he talks about these as the evil triplets, the giant evil triplets, and that you can't really take one down without the other. And he draws the real connections, right, between those. That it made me really think of our place in the world. Most people, right, migrate not because they want to, but because they have to. So I think one of the questions, like maybe all of us in this room could ask ourselves is like, why am I here? You know, how did I get here? What are the reasons that brought me here physically, geographically to this location? And I think once you start doing that, you start unpacking the dynamics of war and colonization and imperialism, right? So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Peace. So I didn't grow up in like a quote unquote woke family. Like some of the conversations I hear young people in Seattle have, like I would have never had as a young person. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana. My father is Black and my mother is white, so I am the descendant of both white settler colonials and formerly enslaved Black peoples, which is complicated when we talk about the land that we're on, because one part of me didn't ask to be here and the other part brought that part here. And so when I think about conversations like anti-militarism, it goes to a little bit of a different place. So I was taught that acquisition of power would get me access. So I was taught to occupy and colonize, that by acquiring power, by working in and through the system, I could acquire enough power to have access to power to be okay. That's what I was taught, American dream bullshit. But over the course of time, also growing up in the Christian church, which is its own complicated bullshit. Sorry, folks. Happy Easter. It was also April Fool's Day, so you know. I'm recovering. But I went to Seattle Pacific University, and I remember sitting in classrooms where I was the only person of color, but I was the only Black person. And learning things that started to feel not right, and starting to question them. Fast forward, I go to law school, and I'm sitting in a property class where a professor is teaching the Macintosh trilogy, like all the things about the Discovery Doctrine, and nobody is questioning the stealing of land. Fast forward a little bit forward, and I'm at my first internship at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I am working on Guantanamo Bay cases. And at the same time, George Zimmerman is on trial for the murder of Trayvon Martin, and he is acquitted of murder. And so all these things are swirling around in my head, and I am enraged by what just happened in this court system, that I'm being told by UW Law that if you just follow the process, justice will prevail. And I don't see justice prevail. In fact, we've never seen justice prevail when a cop murders a Black person, or really any person. And so I go into the streets in New York City, and I've protested in Seattle before. I was not fortunate enough to see the WTO protest here, but I'm in New York City, and in the streets are all these different types of cops I never knew existed. There are like Homeland Security, and I can't even think of the list, but they all have different types of equipment on them, and I'm starting to feel like I'm in an occupied space. I come back to Seattle, and on November 24th, 2014, the non-indictment of Darren Wilson is announced in Ferguson. And I go into the streets with my comrades because I need a place to mourn with people who feel the same way that I do. And within an hour, SPD is throwing flashbangs and macing people and using their bikes as weapons. And so after 28 years or so, however old I was in 2014, of growing up in this system, of slowly unpacking what I had internalized about colonialism and occupation as kind of a positive acquisition of power, there was this moment where everything finally clicked into place. And I started to see SPD as an occupying military force. And all of the things that I had experienced growing up and the cognitive dissonance started to unravel itself. And that's when I really got involved in Seattle around how do we dismantle the police? How do we dismantle prisons and the court system? Because that's a part of keeping in place militarism here and getting us very used to it and comfortable with it, so we will justify it in other places. I tell you that long story because most folks who don't grow up in a city like Seattle are not having conversations about anti-militarization on a regular basis. It's not something that young people are talking about in their classrooms. In Indianapolis, Indiana, where I grew up, young people are still being taught the same bullshit that I was taught. And as a result of not getting the opportunity to have the kinds of experiences I've had to question the oppression they've internalized, there's a whole group of folks who don't even know that they've been force-fed a narrative. And I think that's for me, that's the framing of this conversation, is there are a lot of people that don't know that they're buying into a narrative. That's why they think trans folks being excluded from the military is a violation of human rights, as opposed to seeing the military and what we do abroad as a violation of people's global human rights and human dignity, is because we've been told acquire power and then you'll be all right. But we're never told about all the people, like the folks at Guantanamo Bay, upon whom that power is built and how it was acquired. And for me, Black Lives Matter was a huge moment of coming to a realization of what militarism in general, how that continues to oppress Black folks in my own community, but how our investment in that structure is oppression of people globally.
Amadakipi. Chante washtea nape chuzapi, wakiam waratan amachiapi, ya waslahan amataha yellow, ate wayagi Charles Remle, ina wayagi Donna Harrison, Duwamish oyate na Duwamish makocheki awawi chakiayo. Good evening, my English name is Matt Remle, my Lakota name is Wakia Wa'anatan. I'm from Standing Rock, but been living here in Seattle for quite a while. Out in South Beacon Hill. And first and foremost, want to acknowledge Duwamish folks, Duwamish land, and I'm going to speak a little bit of that history here in a second, but and to the organizers and to the other panelists for inviting me to speak here tonight. And it's an honor to be amongst you all. You killed it with that intro. I felt there wasn't really much to add to that, but that was amazing. So I'll just add a little depth of history in specifically a Native history into the narrative of militarism. The military, of course, the U.S. military, that is, came about because of the colonization of our lands in attempts to settle the West. That's the foundation of the U.S. military. The goals of it haven't changed. Locations and geographies may have changed, but the goals to expand colonialism around the globe, to remove indigenous populations, to access the resources for the benefit of settler colonizers remains the same to this day. A little bit about the place where we're sitting. One of the first acts of the forerunner of the Seattle City Council was to pass an act to ban and prohibit any native peoples from the Seattle city limits. At that time, of course, it was predominantly Duwamish peoples, whom, ironically, years before, helped those same folks survive the winters out here in Alki Beach area where they first settled, and brought them over to actually in this area here to survive. A few years later, they, of course, turned their backs on them, have their own government, and one of the acts, like I said, was to ban Native peoples from this area. That was followed by white militias going around and burning down all the longhouses in this area, including one not too far from where this library is. A longhouse housed about roughly 100 to 200 individuals, a collection of families, burned and driven out of what would become Seattle. My own family, so I'm Lakota, we declared war against the United States back in the 1860s for their attempts to colonize our lands, and specifically the Black Hills, of which we actually defeated the United States, and that's how we got our treaty, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. And this is important to know because it directly ties into the fight at Standing Rock that most people are now familiar with. Following the military there, the defeat of the U.S. military, they still wanted to acquire our lands and resources because the Black Hills, which is sacred to us, where many of our sacred sites are located, to where we conduct ceremonies as instructed as Lakota people to fulfill annually, is one of the most mineral resource-rich areas in the entire globe. Many of the wealthy families, the Bushes, and all of them who derived their wealth directly from the stolen resources and gold coming out of the Black Hills. So they still wanted access to the Black Hills, but because they couldn't militarily defeat us, they devised other strategies to attempt to subjugate our peoples. And the two things they did, one was they paid folks, both from the military and they call them buffalo hunters, to come out west and to just slaughter the buffalo. The buffalo was our economy, much in the same way that the Coast Salish people's economy is around the salmon and fishing. Well, the buffalo was our economy. The population of buffalo went from 100 million down to 28 in a very short time span. And those 28 buffalo actually ended up in what's now that big park in Montana. Why am I spacing it? Yellowstone, thank you. So there was an attempt to military subjugate us by destroying our traditional economy and our food supply, and that was followed by a second act, which was to, they passed the boarding school policy, Indian boarding school policy, where it was required of all Indian children from ages 4 to 18 to be militarily removed from their homes and placed into these government-sponsored and church-ran boarding schools off reservation. So these were the two policies put in place to subjugate us to get access to the resources. That was followed up by a camp of mass slaughterings that we saw at Wounded Knee. The Wounded Knee was the largest military buildup in this land until 1970s, when the American Indian movement and others reoccupied the site of Wounded Knee. And at that time, that became the largest military buildup on U.S. soil since the 1890s slaughter at Wounded Knee. Fast forward to just a few years ago, the third largest military gathering happened in Standing Rock. as we were fighting against Dakota Access Pipeline. So remember I was mentioning colonization is about the removal of indigenous peoples off their lands to access resources for the benefit of settler colonial peoples. And that's exactly what happened at Standing Rock. You saw a joint effort, militarized effort. You had police jurisdictions around the country being brought out there, along with Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the CIA, the National Guard, and other military forces with snipers on hills pointed down into our camps to remove us from our lands to build this pipeline, not for our benefit, but for the benefit of corporations. So I'm bringing this all up as a very local example of militarism that continues to happen against us in our own homelands, precisely what Nikkita is talking about. The only other thing I'd like to add is if folks do need to express themselves in some form of kind of when you're talking people like wanting to fight against something, then join us on the front lines in Standing Rock. You don't need to join the U.S. military. We got warriors out there fighting against these corporations and stuff like that. You're more than welcome to come with us, and you're welcome to be whomever you are. Bring your families, just like those who might have went to Standing Rock. I'm sure you felt very welcomed out there and loved. So there are other ways to express yourself other than joining the U.S. military. Thank you.
Thank you all for such thoughtful ways of bringing us into how you think about this stuff. It's really, really helpful and really packed with important histories and experiences that help us set a frame around it. One thing I wondered if you'd speak to, any of you or all of you as much as you want, is the fact that there's been a lot of histories of different marginalized groups being excluded from the U.S. military and then included. And there's been perhaps some patterns across different movements of what those moments of advocacy do and look like and how they play out. And I wondered if anyone wants to speak to any of those parallels, because I think they can be instructive for us.
So Angelica Chazaro was supposed to be here tonight, and I am a very poor stand-in for that badass, fierce, and fearless lawyer and organizer and thinker, but she would kill me if I didn't bring this up, which is that, various forms of the DREAM Act have included military participation as a path to legalization, a path to out of the oppression of being undocumented. That is nothing new, right? In fact, some of you have probably heard of the Moynihan Report. So the Moynihan Report comes out in the 1960s, and it talks about the pathology, the cultural pathology of black families, right? And it essentially pathologizes black women in particular and black female-headed households, and uses that as the explanatory, description of black families, why black families are in poverty. And it's a terrible report. It has huge implications and lasting implications, not only in terms of public programs and government, but also in terms of sort of public perceptions, right, of blackness. One of the things that doesn't get talked about much is that the report poses as a solution military participation of black men. That they say the way to solve this pathology, right, this culture of poverty in the black community is to send black men into the military. And what's happening at that time? The Vietnam War, right? That's one example, but we can also look at other examples of when black people have been sent to war, right, and come back to face Jim Crow, or even worse, right? In some ways, war and military participation has also been a politicizing moment, particularly for people who see the blatant hypocrisy, the brutal lie, right, of racial logic and racial thinking, of some people deserve to live, some people don't deserve to live. One of the things that I was going to mention too is that, military participation has always offered you material benefits, right? You can get the benefits of a veteran's pension or health care or free education, right? These are the material benefits that the state has used to bribe us into participating in an institution of death, essentially, death and destruction. And I think that one of the ways that it does this is also hinging very much on ideas of gender, right? Of hyper-masculinity, of strength. And there's a way that our ideas of gender and our ideas of race are so cleaved together in institutions of violence. And the ways that we think about national boundaries, for example. I mean, people literally still in the military refer to enemy territory as Indian country, right? The term gook, which is a derogatory racial slur that's used usually against Asians, has been used against people around the world by the military, including Haiti, right? Including Arabs, including Africans, historically. So we're all bound, I think, within this really warped logic of what is required of us to be safe, to be powerful, to be included, right? And it's very much gendered, and I think that there's something really potent, potentially, right, about building a trans and queer resistance movement to the military in this moment, especially when we're living in a time of, as you said at the very beginning, perpetual war, right? I was in college in 1990s, early 1990s, when the US invaded Iraq, right? When Iraq invaded Kuwait. And I remember at that time, so George Bush, the older one, not the younger one, was speaking to Alec and said, we've done it, we've finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome. And really that set off an era, a new era of war on terrorism, of a state of permanent war. Between 1990 and 97, I think there were 30 US military interventions. How did they do that? Well, they created a different boogeyman, right? It's not communism anymore, it's Islam, it's terrorism. And so I think on some level, if we don't figure out how to crack this nut, if we don't figure out how to end the logic of imperialism, of war, of militarism that started so long ago, it's a death wish, right? Now we're facing the threat of nuclear war with North Korea. Well, when I was a child too, talk about not growing up in a woke family, I didn't even know Korean War had not ended. I was like, oh, that happened, it's done, right? The Korean War never ended. That's why we're in this situation right now. The Korean War was essentially an imperial war between the Soviet Union and the United States, right? The Korean people were just silage, which is so often the case, just fodder, right? So I think this is an existential crisis, and it's something that, it's not queer people or trans people for our own liberation. It's like not, tribal sovereignty and the rights of indigenous people for indigenous people. No, it's for the planet. I mean, the water protectors have been trying to teach us that, right? This is a death wish if we don't figure out how to get out of this way of thinking of deserving, undeserving, who belongs, who doesn't belong.
So this makes me think, again, back to where I grew up. So in the Midwest, it is not unusual to see young poor folks, but also young poor Black and brown folks coerced into military participation. That you are convinced that being in the military is your only way to gain access to the American dream, that by getting some sort of educational benefit, having a steady income, oftentimes they'll tell young folks, like, this will give you discipline. And so as a result, I've had family members and friends join the military, not because they wanted to be a soldier so much, but they wanted to have access to the American dream, quote unquote. And this idea of get your hands dirty with us and then you can belong is really about, I feel like, getting communities implicated in the empire, about getting people so far into it that they feel like they cannot exit it or rebel against it. And in my relationships that I've been able to build with people through things like ILPS or Anak Bayon, learning about black soldiers who did join the military, and they'd go to the Philippines and they would see that they were killing folks who looked just like them in a lot of ways, or were experiencing similar things to them, and were living under the same empire and oppression, and suddenly realized they were playing a role and continuing to push the oppression of the United States globally. And understanding, looking at history. This is why we don't teach young people history. The fact that that black soldiers joined the military during World War II, and when they came back because of the promise of the GI Bill, like, this is your way to be included in U.S. society. When they came back, they were denied access to the GI Bill. The GI Bill was actually one of the root causes of redlining, because there was this promise of, if you go to war for the United States, when you come back, we will help you get a home, we will help you get a college education, and when black families, black soldiers would go to get those homes, they would be denied access to the suburbs. So this promise of the American dream through military service has time and time again been denied to black and brown folks. And they don't tell that history, because usually what happens next is black and brown folks catch on and say, ah, shit, like, this was really just about continuing the oppression over our communities and then getting us to be willing to go oppress other communities and enforce borders we weren't really about in the first place. And so a lot of times you see that the same folks who end up being important figures in movements are the same people who at one point in time participated in military service and saw firsthand what the empire is doing globally. And so I think one of the things that's really important about these kinds of conversations, I think, is actually having people tell those stories of when folks who found themselves in military service because they were coerced by some promise of access decided to rebel against that system, because it happens. How do you undo it if you're not inspiring people to be willing to rebel against it, but also support those folks and be a part of telling those stories so we know it's possible? But it's really important to see the coercion. And it's hard in a place like Seattle to understand why people living in the Midwest, or this final example, I have a lot of friends from Samoa. And one of the only ways for Samoans to get access to U.S. citizenship has been to join the military-industrial complex, to become soldiers. And so they're told that their land is being occupied by the United States, but if you want access to benefits as the benefits of a U.S. citizen, you have to become a part of this military force. And that's why Samoa was one of the biggest military bases in the entire world at one point in time. And so I think we have to understand some of the reasons why people maybe would be coerced into participating in this structure, and find ways to tell a different story. Like Matt was last saying, is there are other ways for us to participate, to gain access to a community, to a movement, to being a part of something bigger than ourselves, which is what I think most people are yearning for, and what those who are invested in the military-industrial complex actually, benefit from. They build in, is our desire to belong, and they use that to coerce people into the military. What else can we be building to bring folks into our movements, to bring folks into anti-militarization, to understand at the root for some communities as to why they would become a part of the empire is because they lack access to resources, access to community, and access to economic opportunity. How do we build alternative sustainable systems that make the military look a whole lot less attractive?
Maybe I should have went first so I didn't have to follow that. I forgot to mention in the first part with the last question, some of my early activism back in the mid-90s was actually, we brought up our first Iraq war, for my own personal involvement was around when Clinton imposed harsh sanctions against Iraq, both economic and medical supplies, which led to the deaths of some 1.5 million Iraqis. The sanctions led to the deaths of some 1.5 million Iraqis, predominantly children, is my understanding. And we also got a different number, please let me know. One of the other angles I wanted to bring in about militarism that's often overlooked, but has a deep impact on tribal communities is what we would call environmental racism. So you need resources to build these bombs, uranium, stuff like that. The majority of uranium mining has taken place on or next to reservations. Just east of us and north of Spokane is the Spokane Indian Reservation, and where a great amount of uranium mining took place. You can go to the Spokane Indian Reservation now, and this is back in the 40s to build the bombs and nuclear bombs in World War II, and these sites were left uncapped. You can literally walk to these, and they look like lakes out there. You can walk up to them. So their entire water supply, we're talking about water, you know, here in 2018, and contaminated water. The Spokane tribe, Spokane people have had contaminated water with uranium since the 1950s. That uranium was taken down to Hanford. Hanford is considered the most polluted site in the Western Hemisphere. How Hanford was acquired is on the Yakima Indian Reservation, and the U.S. military, U.S. Army Corps came in and took that land in the same way that our land was taken for Dakota Access Pipeline to build the Hanford Nuclear Power Plant. So there is a tremendous amount of lupus and other diseases that Native peoples from the Yakima Indian Reservation, some of the other tribes that are downwind of Hanford experience to this day. When I brought up the American Indian Movement takeover of Wounded Knee back in the 70s, that was primarily around the fact that they wanted to do additional uranium mining in the Black Hills. Our water table as Lakota people has already been polluted since the 50s because a vast majority of uranium mining also took place in and around Lakota reservations. Other than mining, you have the testing of these bombs. So some of the test sites, the Western Shoshone people of Nevada, the Western Shoshone tribe, is considered the most bombed nation on earth because over 1,000 nuclear bombs have been detonated on Western Shoshone lands. There's also testing in the Badlands of South Dakota, which is next to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, other Lakota people. There's also testing of these bombs out in Hawaiian Islands, indigenous Hawaiian Islands, as well as down in Puerto Rico. So we live with the consequences of U.S. militarism in our health daily, lower life expectancies, cancers, and so forth. So I just wanted to kind of bring in this other angle that there are other lasting impacts from militarism that poor indigenous communities globally continue to suffer from.
Yeah, so many brilliant things already said. I just wanted to add a couple things. You know, when thinking about histories about this question about militarism and colonialism, and what you said about race and gender being intertwined, I mean, what related to what all of you said, I think about this moment in Jackie Alexander's book or Leslie Feinberg's book where they talk about colonizers coming to Peru and encountering Inca people who they looked at and said, oh, these look like men dressed like women, so what we're going to do is kill them. And actually what we're going to do is feed them to our dogs. And so this idea that we only have this choice of being male or female is a fairly recent idea that we could see as part of Western ideologies enforced on the rest of the world. And even the idea of trans is really a Western medical definition enforced on the rest of the world that doesn't necessarily fit. I mean, the gender binary also doesn't necessarily fit on different cultures in different ways. And when I think about this question about like what are we told versus what's really going on that Nikkita was bringing up, I think about a lot of this question for me about inclusion in the military is always about actually defining who is going to be excluded or who is worthy of being included. So anytime that government or big institutions are saying, oh, we're going to include these people, it's a way of saying we're going to include some of these people so we can say who we're not going to include, right? So South African theorist Akil Mbembe has talked about this idea of necropolitics, which helps me think about all this, that what we're told is that the government is there to keep us safe, keep things orderly, serve and protect, some shit like that, right? And that is part of this European history. But what Mbembe describes from a Global South point of view or from a South African point of view is that actually what governments are there to do today is to keep some people safe and protected and healthy, and to guarantee that other people die. And so I think we see that, again, reproduced in this question of inclusion in the military. It's a way of saying, oh yeah, we'll include trans people who are patriotic, trans people who want to murder for us, trans people who are willing to kill for money. Sure, those are the trans people that we want. Other trans people, we will make sure that their deaths are not even investigated or reported, make sure they don't have jobs or housing.
We're
Who are the person of color and or trans veterans on this panel, though? Any veterans?
Any vets? We don't have vets on this panel. Thanks for asking that. One of the reasons that also led to this conversation, after the Democracy Now! Report, trans vets were some of the people I heard from the most, and it was really interesting. People talking about how the current framing that's happening in the media that Mattilda was talking about that centers like positive experience of military service had made them feel like they couldn't be heard. And some of those people were invited to this panel but don't feel like they want to be publicly seen in that role, like weren't ready. And then I asked one person, could I like take your written story? And they said, I still don't feel like I want to. Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad. Wonderful.
I'm
So
actually, if you would like my seat, I'm happy to relinquish it to you.
I just wonder why I go to the VA and there's probably at least 50 that I know and there's none on the panel, so it frustrates me. So not to take the attention, I just want there to.
I don't mean this like as some sort of like I'm not offering it as like a fake offer, but I'm totally down if one of y'all want to have my seat on the panel for you to take it. I'm literally offering it. But I think what's important to model here is that you're right, I'm not trans, I'm a person of color. And I haven't been in the military because it's not something that I don't think I would be very good in the military. And I don't support the military, I don't support police, and I don't support jails or prisons or courts. It is my life's mission to dismantle those things. But when I say I want to offer you my seat because I think you're pointing out a serious equity issue, I genuinely would like one of y'all to take it if you're interested in having your voice be on the panel.
I just truly want someone who has been there to also be speaking, not for it to be me personally, but someone
Would you like my seat?
I'm just wondering if I can ask folks to use mics because we really want everyone to hear what everyone's saying, and it is time for the Q&A, so we can just have a mic handler just to make sure that people who are hard of hearing don't miss what's being said.
It's also not, am I right? It's not like a zero-sum thing. I mean, you could just join us, or
Yeah.
we could just have a conversation. It's not like one has to leave, one has to come, right?
Well, I just wanted to be clear that, like, I agree, and my way of trying to show I agree and, like, want to, the same way I feel when I go listen to a group of white people talk about black folks, I wanted to step down, but also, like, would love to be joined.
Well, now it's time for the Q&A for anyone in the audience who wants to participate. Any questions you have, any comments, any feedback, anything you want to talk about trans inclusion in the military and its problems. Did you want to start?
Yeah, I can go ahead and start. Again, I'm a transgender veteran. I'm also white passing Native American. My family's from Colville, which also did get hit with poisonous water because of uranium mining. But I don't understand how excluding trans people from the military is actually going to, solve, the military issues. Because of the military, I've actually been able to transition. That's through the VA. Now, when I started, they didn't cover that stuff. I fought for it. But, if I didn't serve in the military, I would not have been able to transition at all. It also got me out of an abusive household in a very poor area where we had no money, no resources. I had no chance of going to college. So either I was going to end up working on a ranch or I was going to end up selling drugs. So being able to go into the military did kind of save my life. Now, I'm not saying that we definitely need the military as big as we do, and it is causing a lot of issues. But how is keeping people like me out of it the solution?
Can I take this one? One thing I'll say about that, because I've had this anti-military position as a trans person publicly, and people often ask me, does this mean that what does this mean about trans people currently in the military and trans vets? And my take on it is, what I'm criticizing is an advocacy strategy that is pro-military and talks about trans people in the military in a way that ignores what the military is really like, both for people in it and people who's been in it. So in my view, we could have a robust trans movement, and many of us already do this, where we fight for the rights of trans vets to access things that they're being denied, where we fight for people who are facing violence and harm in the military or because they were previously in the military, and it doesn't have to be one that produces a fiction. So this is a debate I've had for years with people who run the LGBT pro-military service advocacy. I'm like, can't you just do that advocacy because we care about all those people who are currently and formerly in the military, but not do it in a way that promotes the military, right? Like there's been a huge history, as we've heard, of people in the military and formerly in the military opposing US military imperialism and fighting for the rights of vets and fighting against the privatization of the VA and all the other things we care about. Like, I was a poverty lawyer before this, and so many of my clients and people in my communities are people who are vets, who are suffering from extreme poverty, mental health issues because of their service. So I think that what we're talking about here isn't saying that people who have been coerced into joining the military because of poverty are doing anything wrong for doing that. It's not about targeting people who are in the military who are vets. It's about asking why the most funded LGBT organizations have framed this in a way that lifts up stories like the ones Mattilda was showing, like the military is a vacation and a wonderful place to be trans and a great job, when I think that we know from trans vets in our communities that that's not the case.
I am one of the voices that got interviewed significantly after the trans military ban came out. I did serve in the White House for 2 years, so they really liked interviewing me. I had 2 news articles and a radio interview done on me last year alone. And part of the reason that we need to be able to have trans people in the military, other than them being able to serve if they want to, is because the more you limit what trans people can do in the military, the more they limit the services we get in the VA. You open up the military in order to get trans people in there, and if they get in there and start getting the proper medical care they need, we might actually start getting more care at the VA. So it will solve other issues.
So I think for me, one of the, thinking about my own community, thinking about young Black and brown youth who choose to go into the military because there is no other option. I think about my brother-in-law who was living in San Diego, and he was told he was undisciplined, he would never get into college, he wouldn't be able to get a job, so he joined the Navy. And what I hope we would do, as opposed to criticize people who make decisions for their well-being in an economic system that is intentionally oppressive to those of us who are not white, cisgender, men, wealthy, and Christian, It builds everything around that group of people and tells the rest of us, if you want to belong, if you want to have access, you have to do X, Y, Z, one of which is military service. What I would rather us do is think about how do we build an alternative system that doesn't determine who is worthy of education and worthy of healthcare and worthy of economics, so that our only decision doesn't become join the military, become a basketball player, or hope you get a rap contract. You know, that's what it is in my community. So I think at the root of this is challenging the whole system that has structured itself to determine who was worthy as a human being and who was worthy as capital. And that is rooted in this whole system of colonization and occupation. And it does, I think it does make me uncomfortable to have conversations with my family members who are in the military about you are a part of an occupying force globally that is literally doing to Black and brown folks around the rest of the world that was done to us. And it may have happened pre-1700s, but we're repeating the same behavior again. And so for those of us who consider ourselves anti-military and consider ourselves abolitionists, it is actually more important that we figure out what we're striving to build than it is for us to always be talking about what we're trying to tear down. And so what I hear in like this dialogue about access is what are we providing? It's just like when I work with young people who are caught in gang culture, and I'm supposed to be like, yo, leave that gang that you in that's become your family, your economic service, your home, you know, all the things that you need. But then I'm like, but I don't actually know what you're supposed to go to. I have to be providing a sustainable alternative for that young person, for them to leave this system that they have been able to find their health in. So, I mean, that's what I'm hearing, but that's the root that I come at it from, because I also think in my community there's a certain coercion that if you want to be cared for and you want to be cared about, then you got 3 options, and you better hope one of them comes through for you.
I think it's also important to point out that no one is saying that trans people who are in the military and accessing basic services in order to live shouldn't have those services. I think what we're saying is that the military, as a central institution of global oppression, you know, busy obliterating the world in service of U.S. empire and corporate profit, should not be the way that people access those services, right? And I think if we look at it from a movement standpoint, we can take a look at these LGBT organizations and we can say, what if all the money that's being put into the fight for gays in the military, the fight for trans people in the military, what if that money was actually put into creating the services that people need without the military, right? And I think instead of calling, you know, for the necessity to fight in U.S. wars, all of us, you know, queer, trans, everyone else, needs to be talking about the necessity to fight against U.S. imperialism, and that means centrally opposing the military. And I think if we take a look at the rhetoric around trans inclusion in the military, right, people say, or these institutions say to us, oh, well, there are more trans people in the military than any other employer, right? Never mind that that's a fake statistic pulled out of one demographic study, which was a general demographic study about trans people in general, where they had 70 questions. One of the questions was, you know, have you ever been in the military? It wasn't why, when, or how, and there were no other questions. There were no other, no one said, how many trans people work at Goodwill? No one said, how many trans people are social workers? No one said, there was nothing to compare it to, because the only goal was to support U.S. imperialism. And I think if we just took one other institution, people are saying there's so many trans people in the military because there's so many people in the military, period, right? So there are 1.35 million people on active duty in the military at one time in particular. So if we take a look at prisons, for example, there are 2.3 million people approximately in prison at any one time. And as we all know from many, many, many statistical studies, trans people are overrepresented in the prison system, especially trans women and especially trans women of color. And so what if we had a movement that instead of calling for the right for trans people to serve in unjust wars was about getting trans people out of prison? And I think we need to be talking about getting trans people, queer people, people of color, disabled people, everyone in this country accesses to the services that, yes, sometimes the military can get you out of a dead-end town, can get you access to health care, can get you trans-affirming services, health care, transition, a wide range of services. Sometimes the military does become a way of supporting yourselves, but how do we create options so that isn't the case? Because that is tragic. That is not progress. That is horrifying. To say that it's progress, that, this institution that it's about obliterating villages around the world by pressing buttons in Nevada, that somehow we need to be supporting that. That isn't progress. That's a sad, tragic symptom of our place in U.S. empire. And everyone on the panel has been talking very clearly about the active role in colonization that the U.S. has been engaging in and continues to engage in now. And so I think we need to be talking about how do we take ourselves out of those systems of oppression and make it so that they are no longer necessary for anyone.
I just want to add, I wanted to add also that I am not in favor of excluding trans people from the military. I'm not in favor, that's not what I was trying to argue for. I'm not in favor of excluding trans people from any job that they want to do. What I am in favor of is ending war and ending prisons and ending police and ending the military. And you should be able to have whatever transition services you need and a decent job without having to sign up to kill people for it. It's possible. I mean, I think the whole point of Trump saying he wants to ban trans people from the military is to set a gigantic legal example to say, yes, it's perfectly reasonable to ban trans people from X profession and say that it's too expensive. Whereas, whatever, drive 3 hours north and you can have whatever surgery you want for free. Plenty of other countries have figured out how to provide services for trans people without asking them to murder people for it.
Okay.
We have a question.
And also, it's a long-term plan. I'm talking about decolonization. I mean, we've had colonization for 500 years. I'm not talking about this happening tomorrow. I'm talking about restructuring society.
So we've got, so we've got 15 minutes, and I'm going to try to get through questions. 5 minutes, excuse me. So we've got half a question. And I'll take one question here, and then we'll go back over here.
Hi, I'm really glad. Thank you. You've deepened my analysis, and I appreciate that. I want to say that I'm old, so way back in the day, I almost joined the military. I was somebody who, I'm transracially adopted, and I wound up in the foster care system, as many transracial adoptees do, because we're thrown out of our families of origin, particularly if you're genderqueer. And I wound up on the streets of New York, and in the shelters, they would scream at us every night to go into the military. I'm talking screaming for 2 hours at us every night to go into the military. And then more in group homes, more propaganda at us in the group homes. And I'm saying that transracially adopted queers deserve better than that. Our kids deserve better than that. And so that's one thing I want to say. And the second thing is when all this started, an organization asked for $25,000 from the community to support some lawsuit about this. $25,000. Where I come from, that's a lot of money. So I asked them, in the last 10 years, have you ever put $25,000 to getting trans kids off the streets? Or $25,000 to any services for trans folks in prison? And the answer was no. And so I am not willing, I don't care, I am not willing to spend that kind of money after that stupid gay marriage thing happened and millions of dollars happened and our kids are still on the street and transgendered people are still overpopulating dangerous jails. I am not willing to have another one of these never-ending, endless amounts of money things that don't speak to what I want. I am not willing to do it. And the last thing I'll say is, had I joined the Coast Guard, which is what I wanted to do, to be search and rescue in the Coast Guard, I would have wound up turning back Haitian refugees who were fleeing to here for help and health care and to eat and to be alive. And as a Jew, I'm telling you that if I had had to do that, I would have killed myself. So there is a price, and it is an untenable, horrible price.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, all the panelists. I am here as a veteran. I'm also here as a cis person and as a white person. So I recognize the space that I'm taking up, and I respect everyone in the room for allowing me that. I absolutely agree with every single thing all of you have brought to the table. The reason that I wanted to speak today so badly is because of the lack of representation of veterans on the panel. As a veteran, gave me opportunities to work in the fishing industry, which I worked for 10 years as a laborer, and I came to a point where I had an opportunity to work as a civilian for the Coast Guard. So I have worked for the last 10 years as a civilian back with the military, where I never imagined I would be. I believe the military needs to end. I believe that it is deeply, deeply flawed for everything that it imagines going forward and everything that you've presented. However, it is an example of civil service. I learned things in my 4 years in the Marine Corps that taught me how to be a better human, a community member, an activist, being able to be present for the immigrants of color who speak English as a second language that I serve in the fishing vessel safety community. And I do believe that we need to restructure our military into civil service. We might not see it in our lifetimes, any of us in this room, but it is an example. And as this individual mentioned, our veterans care system is the only example of socialized medicine that is attempting to even happen in this country. So we need to look at that and see how we can make corrections with the veterans to have a successful socialized medicine. So to just come here and say the military is a horrible machine that we need to have it end is, I think, speaking to the choir, we're talking into an echo chamber. But to listen to veterans who don't believe in that system anymore, but have had life benefit from it to be better community members, how can we take those systems that we benefited from and create civil service that works for us and move forward? And I believe that the deconstruction of our military is important, and trans civil rights are separate issues. So to lump them together, it feels a little unfair because it's excluding trans veterans by not having them on the panel. So I hope that I've made a little bit of sense. I hope I've contributed to the conversation in the fact that I'm taking up so much space here as a cis white person. But I do thank all of you for really providing a lot of history on the destruction that the military does on our world, and I want to see that end. But I also want to see trans folks have civil rights to gain the same experience that I did in leadership and discipline. I liked it. I was into it. Whoever mentioned, Nikkita, I believe, discipline is something that is a draw in poor and person of color communities to bring those military members in, and it uses them up and turns them out. But what if we can take those people that don't have access to education and that want to get out of a small town that's hurting them and put them into civil service where they're helping the world, helping the country, helping their fellow community members? That's what I would love to see us talking about in the future. Thank you.
If I could just real quickly, I want to thank you all for your service. For those who are familiar with the Native community, know that we actually completely uphold our veterans, Native and non-Native. I'm sure if you've been to powwows, you know during our grand entries, our Native veterans and non-Natives are in that grand entry, and we recognize them. And some of our veterans have come back and been some of our biggest leaders in Indian country. When I mentioned Wounded Knee Occupation, both Dennis Banks and Russell Means, who were leaders of American Indian Movement, were both veterans. That said, when I mentioned Standing Rock, I was sitting on the drum that sang all those veterans that came out to support us, Native and non-Natives, and it was a very beautiful sight. And what I saw from a lot of these, especially the non-Native veterans coming out, we were very honest with them because they were seeing what we've been discussing, that the country, the United States, was engaged in the continued colonization of our lands, and here they were fighting with us. But it was a very beautiful thing. So, thank you, and feel free to come to any powwow, and you be honored that way. And with that said, it's okay to hold critiques and criticisms of these various institutions. Me personally, I have a huge one against our financial institutions and call out our tribes and tribal governments who still take money from the likes of Wells Fargo and stuff. So, but that doesn't mean that any of us push out or discard anybody from our communities. So, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can I just say one quick thing? I'm sorry, I would be remiss, and I had conversations with folks earlier today and promised I would bring this up, which is April 4th, this Wednesday, is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King in Memphis, a year to the day after he gave his Beyond Vietnam speech. Also on April 4th, on Wednesday, there's a plane of deportees being sent back to Southeast Asia, including about 50 Cambodian refugees. And these are people who, well, I won't go into the history of US wars in Southeast Asia, but certainly people who don't have any real relationship with Cambodia as a geographical and cultural place. They grew up in this country, many of them situated in poor, low-income neighborhoods, and many of them facing extreme racism, criminalization, et cetera. In fact, all of them have spent time in the criminal justice system. And so it's really a painful way to mark the 50th anniversary and 51st anniversary of that courageous speech that King made, really drawing the linkages between why are people poor, why can't we get the health care we need, why can't we get the services we need in our communities? Well, mainly because this public institution, right, is taking our tax dollars and spending them to create these incredibly impossible, devastated, uranium-laden, poisoned places around the world. And now we're shipping people back to these sites of kind of colonial brutality. And so it's, again, I just want to emphasize what everyone on this panel has said today, but if we don't figure this out, it is a death wish, right? There are a few people, it's like Barbara Smith said in like the 1980s, right? There's a few mad people at the top calling the shots for all of us. And, you know, she was saying, like, black feminism is really about creating a space on this globe that is fit for human life, right? I think indigenous nationhood also, we can learn from that about, we're talking about nationhood as a place where we live and work and eat and take care of each other, right? Not nationhood as a means for justifying war and violence that we inflict on each other. So I do think, I appreciate your questions because it does ask us, what's next? Where are we going from here, right? So I appreciate that question because I think it challenges all of us to not just to channel our rage and our pain and our trauma and our, you know, everything into our revolutionary imagination of like, what can we do to create and make sure that people do have education and don't have to be enticed into joining the military to get what they need.
Thank you so much for this panel. I learned a lot. I want to address the question of civil service and the military as a conduit for the cultivation of civil service. Because I think that the value that you are according to civil service and then valorizing it, that value, it really accrues and serves global capital, right? The valuation of civil service and participation, it's really serving global capital because the military serves global capital. And it serves global capital because it is providing the rationale for the American arms industry, which is directly tied to our national economy. And as long as we have the arms industry and we don't eradicate the arms industry, there will always be a rationale for the existence of the military. And so we think that we will cultivate notions of citizenship by being in the military, but we're really supporting the accruing of global capital.
Thanks for that. We are about to have the sound system cut off, so I just want to say a few final closing words. So grateful to this panel for being here and for having this conversation. I think the framing that trans people's rights are a separate issue from the question of US military imperialism is exactly what we were trying to disrupt during this session. And in case other people are interested in really thinking through what queer and trans opposition to US militarism looks like in Seattle, Mattilda and I just organized a quick follow-up meeting. So if you're interested, on April 11th, which is a Wednesday night at 7 p.m., we're gonna meet in room C1 of the Seattle University School of Law, which is at 12th and Columbia. Room C1, 7 p.m., April 11th. So if other people are interested in thinking about creative ways to build queer and trans anti-military imperialism activism here in Seattle, please join us. Thank you all so much. Thank you, DAVIDA, for hosting us.
And two quick announcements. First, can we have a round of applause for our panel? So we normally let people know how you can stay in touch with public engagement programming. We mentioned Legendary Children on April 14th, but I would be incredibly remiss if I didn't tell you that Youth Speaks will be having their open mic here. There we go. Youth right now, there's truth right now. April 9th, they're having their open mic, and also I was excited to see Nikkita on the panel. We partnered with her organization, Creative Justice, to do an art display at City Hall called Someday We'll All Be Free. It's an art exhibition about prison abolition, and I encourage you to check it out. It'll be up through May 1st. Please, 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 on a night like tonight where conversations about privilege, representation, unity, and community have been such a big part, fill out your surveys. Tell us what you want us to talk about the next time. Your voice really matters, and thank you for your passion and your honesty tonight. Thank you.